All right, factor markets. This is quite an interesting chapter. Before we go ahead, let's clarify something for ourselves. When we talk about factors of production, we're talking about inputs or resources. These three terms are synonymous. If you don't like factors is kind of like a fancy term. If you don't like that, just say inputs or resources. And you know resources from intro, the four resources: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. That's what we're talking about. And we're talking about the price of those. So factor prices are the same as input costs. It's the same as prices of resources. All right, again, you can use those interchangeably. So the theme of the chapter is, why is it that some people make more money than others? Why is it that certain resources are more expensive than others? And the answer is very simple. The answer is the same answer as you would give for anything else. So for instance, think of chicken legs and chicken breast. Which one is more expensive, assuming the same units, let's say 1 pound of each? Well, if you go to the store, you would notice that chicken breasts are more expensive than chicken legs. Or think of apples and cherries. Which one is more expensive per pound? Cherries are more expensive. Now these are outputs, these are final goods and services. But you can have the same thing about inputs. You can have the same kind of analysis about factors. Think of workers, let's say a pilot versus a bus driver. Who makes more money? Who has a higher salary? The pilot, right? Or think of land. Let's say rent in downtown versus the suburbs. So think of Toronto, where the real estate market is more dynamic and a lot more active. Where is it more expensive to rent, let's say, one apartment or a certain amount of land? Obviously, in downtown, Toronto is a lot more expensive than the suburbs. Okay. Now the question is, in all of these cases, the logic is the same, and the logic is the logic of the market, the supply and demand. So the price of anything, whether it's an output or an input, goes up because of scarcity. And scarcity is the same as shortage. Okay, remember shortage and surplus? So what creates scarcity? There can be two causes for scarcity. One is that there is low supply of it, it's hard to make, or there is high demand for it, so it's very popular, or it's both of them. So it could be either and or both of them, right? So that's the idea. Whenever there is scarcity of anything, then the price is going to go up. So for instance, think of pilots. It's much easier to become a bus driver than become a pilot. That's why there's less pilots and they get more money for it. All right. Or think of land in downtown. The land in downtown is much more limited than land in suburbs. That's why the prices are different. So it's the same logic. If you think of chicken legs and chicken breasts, it's not about supply difference, because each chicken or rooster or whatever, it comes with a proportionate number of legs and breasts. So it must be because of demand, and there is more demand for breast because it's boneless. All right. There were some nice animations in this clip, so you might want to watch it again. But pause here and take notes. The most sensitive and important factor of production is labor. We care about our jobs. We care about employment. So for that reason, we're going to talk about the labor market. And the labor market is like any other market where you have supply and demand. Now, in this case, we have the supply of labor and the demand for labor. And like any other market, we have the quantity of labor and the price of labor. All right. So one thing is, who are the demanders or the buyers of labor? Think of it. Who is it that would like to hire workers, right? So that's going to be employers or producers. Okay, so the firms in this case are the demanders. And who are the suppliers or sellers of labor? Labor is really the time of the workers. Out of their 24 hours, how much of their time they're going to offer to work for someone else, right? So that's going to be households or workers. Okay, so the general population. So in this case, it's a little bit backwards, in the sense that usually the supply is the firms, or the suppliers are the firms, and the demanders are the households. But in the labor market, it's the other way around. But still, it's the same mechanism. It's the same logic, right? So we can still follow exactly the same principles of the market to analyze the case of labor. The price of labor is called wage rate. Okay, so the P, you can kind of get rid of it because it's not an appropriate symbol. And instead of that, we usually put W. So W stands for the wage rate. All right, and in this case what you get is the labor market. So the labor market, remember, market means the interaction of buyers and sellers of something. Labor market means the interaction of the buyers and sellers of labor. In other words, it means the interaction of employers and employees. All right, that's what it means. And the point of intersection, like any other market, would be the equilibrium. So that's going to give us the quantity and the wage where the two parties agree on. All right. So there is this thing called diminishing marginal product of labor, right? Marginal product of labor has this abbreviation MPL that says that the more workers the firm hires, the less each new worker will add to its profit. All right, this is quite an important thing, and you've seen this before, by the way. If you remember, we had this example of mowers. If you have only one mowing machine and a lot of workers coming to help you out, at some point they're not going to be useful anymore, right? Because of the limited space, each additional worker is not going to be as productive as the previous ones, right? And the downward slope of the labor demand curve actually represents this. What it says is that the firm's willingness to pay for each new worker is less than its willingness to pay for the previous worker. In other words, if you're a firm and you want to hire someone, the first worker that you hire is going to be very valuable to you because you're moving from 0 to 1. The second worker is going to be less valuable than the first one. The third one is going to be less valuable than the second one, and so forth, right? So if you see the labor demand curve sloping downwards, is because of this diminishing marginal product of labor. Pause here, do a nice graph for yourself, and take some notes. Wow, that was cool. All right, we're going to talk about labor demand shifters. So you've seen shifters before. These are events that make a firm hire more workers. So remember, labor demand is coming from the firms. The firms are the demanders of labor. Okay, so the first shifter is output price. Let's say we are talking about apples. Okay, if you have apples, then that's your output. The input of apples in terms of labor would be farmers. Okay, so let's say you have a big apple farm. You would hire people to grow apples for you and to pick apples for you. Those are the laborers that you have, right? Now, if apples become more expensive, you would like to sell more apples because you make more money. And if you want to sell more apples, you need more apple pickers, right? So you would be willing to pay more for them. So that's going to increase your demand for apple pickers. It's going to increase your demand for labor because it becomes profitable to hire more workers. Another shifter is technological improvement. So if you have better technology, first of all, what does that mean? Better technology means faster and more efficient production. Okay, so it's kind of like the rate or speed of production, which means lower unit cost of production. This unit cost is somewhat important. Unit cost means average cost. Okay, so you take the total cost and you divide it by the quantity. So on average, it becomes cheaper to make things. And that's going to increase the capacity of the firm to produce. In other words, it's going to make the firm more able to expand and increase its quantity. Better technology typically makes each worker more productive, right? Which means that there is going to be a higher marginal product of labor. And we know that whenever there is a higher marginal product of labor, there is more demand for workers. In other words, think of it like this. Better technology means better knowledge, right? Better means or ways of doing things, or better machinery in a way. If you have better machinery or better knowledge on how to do things, then your workers can be more productive. They can utilize that knowledge in order to be more productive. Technology doesn't replace labor, but it enables the firms to hire more labor. This is kind of important. This is a fallacy. This is a misconception. A lot of times people think that technology is bad because it's going to replace the workers. That's not really true. It's the other way around. Technology actually enables us to hire more workers because it makes the firm more profitable. Technology is labor augmenting, not labor saving. All right, so those are two important terms, and they really depend on the time frame you're talking about. If you focus on the short run, yeah, in the short run, technology can be harmful. At the beginning, when technology comes, it kind of destroys some jobs, but that's only in the short run. If you look a little bit more long term, then what happens is that technology creates a lot of opportunities to hire more workers. And a lot of times those workers are in other more skilled, more specified industries. So one example of that is internet or electricity. These things facilitate production, they lower the unit cost of the firms, and because of that they can expand. The wages have increased by over 100%, and 100% means double, in the past 40 years, and we're talking about real terms, excluding inflation. But the firms also hired 50% more labor. Just think of the logic. This may seem like contravening the law of demand, but it's not, because we're not keeping other things constant. So the wages are higher, but firms have also hired more workers. Why? Because of higher capacity, because of technology, because they have been able to hire more workers. All right, pause here and take notes. Another labor demand shifter is the availability of other factors. And here we have to talk about two things. Sometimes you have another input which is jointly needed with labor in production. And when we talk about jointly needed, it's really the same as complements. Remember complements like, I don't know, fries and hamburgers, right? Or ketchup and whatever. So what happens is that you need both of them. So if there is less of the other input available, then each worker can be less productive. So the marginal productivity of labor is going to decrease. And that's why the demand for labor is going to decrease. So one example of that would be computers and employees. Let's say you have a company where you have some computers and you have some workers working on those computers. If you have less computers available, then your work is going to become useless, right? They cannot really work effectively. So your demand for workers will also decrease. If another input is a substitute for labor in production, then what happens is that if the supply of the other factor decreases, then you would need more workers, so the demand would increase. So an example of that would be plowing trucks and human shovelers, right? So basically, if you have a plowing company and you have trucks versus, you can do it either with trucks or manually, and if your trucks break down, then you will need more shovelers, right? So basically the idea is that there is a form of substitutes here happening, and if one of them doesn't work, then you have to switch to the other one, right? That's kind of cool. Another example would be robots, right? If you have robots who can take the place of human workers, then that's the case. Robots and trucks will cause the demand for labor to increase for more skilled workers. This is kind of important. When we talk about the replacement of workers by machines, it's true, it happens sometimes, but what happens is that it also comes with an increase in demand for more skilled workers, right? So think of self checkouts, right? So automated checkouts. What happens is that it reduces demand for cashiers. A lot of cashiers lose their jobs, but it also creates a lot more demand for programmers and technicians to make those automated checkouts and to program them. All right. So in other words, technology or robots and all these things, they are not really bad for us. They actually make us able to specialize and educate ourselves. So let's move on to labor supply, and labor supply is about the general population, the workers. So people have to choose between labor and leisure, and these are two very important economic terms. In economics, leisure means any activity other than working, anything that doesn't earn income, like sleeping, playing, studying, volunteering. Now, it doesn't have to be fun, right? In everyday language, when we say leisure, it's usually something fun, but in economics, it's not always fun, right? So if it makes you feel any better, right now you're having leisure, yeah? So the idea is that as long as you don't make money on it, it's called leisure. The opposite of that is labor. Labor is a part of your day for which you are paid. All right, so the amount of time in your day for which you are paid. Which means if you add them up, the quantity of labor plus the quantity of leisure would add up to 24 hours per day. All right, so it kind of captures all of your day. Now, the opportunity cost of 1 hour of leisure is the money that you could have earned had you worked at 1 hour. In other words, if you decide not to work for 1 hour, then what is it that you're sacrificing? You're sacrificing the money that you could have otherwise earned, right? So that's the idea. If the wage goes up, what's going to happen? Let's say you're having a nice time, having some leisure, not doing anything, and if you're told that there is a good opportunity that you can make a lot of money, then it's going to change your incentives. Maybe you won't waste so much time anymore, and instead of that, you're going to work more. So the quantity of leisure is going to go down, the quantity of labor is going to go up. And that's why the labor supply curve slopes up. So the reason why the labor supply curve slopes up, it has a positive slope, which means a positive correlation between wage and the quantity of labor. Pause here. Labor supply shifters. So the first one is tastes, which is basically people's attitudes toward work versus leisure. So one example of that is the idea whether women should work or stay at home. So in the 60s and 70s, there was this movement where women started to join the labor force more and more. Well, if that's the case, then that's going to augment your labor force. It's going to increase a lot more supply, right? If at some point people have the opposite view or something that contravenes that, then that's going to reduce your labor supply. Another one is alternative opportunities. So if workers in one industry can find better jobs in another industry, what's going to happen? In the first industry, the supply of labor is going to go down, and in the second industry, it's going to go up, right? So the supply of labor in the first industry is going to drop. Now, better jobs is kind of vague. You have to clarify what you mean by that. In this case, what we mean is better wage, or better conditions, or better hours, or a mix of these. All right. So for instance, let's say you have farmers being attracted to gardening, right? What happens is that the supply of farmers is going to drop. Now this thing, when we talk about opportunities, they have to be related. So they have to need the same skills. All right. Otherwise it wouldn't work. So when the farmers move from the farming industry to the gardening industry, the number of farmers available is going to reduce. Another one is population, and anything that affects the population, anything that increases the population is going to increase the supply of labor. So one good example of that is immigration. So if you have more people coming in, then there is more people available to work. Another thing is health conditions. So better health conditions means higher life expectancy and lower infant mortality. Those two, by the way, are measures of health, very common measures. What happens is that it's going to increase the number of people who are able to work, right? It's going to increase your working population. Another example of that would be birth rates. Now, birth rates take a little bit of time to kick in, right? In order for them to reach the working age. Pause here and take notes. Wow, that was cool. All right, let's go back to the general idea of factor prices. First of all, just to remind ourselves, when we talk about land in economics, we're talking about all natural resources, whatever it is, whether it's wood or oil or water, wind, sunshine, whatever, all of that is land. And capital is the equipment and structure used in production of goods and services. So for instance, machinery, roads, trucks, storage, right? All of those would be examples of capital, and labor is workers. Now the question is how much land, labor, and capital to employ? That's the question to answer. How would a firm answer this question? How would they make a decision? So for each unit of an input employed, let's say for each worker that they want to employ, by the way, the word employ is not just for workers, it means usage. So you might want to write that down. Employ means use, okay? So for any unit of input that they want to use, then they have to look at their firm's benefit. The benefit of that unit to the firm is the value added by that unit to the firm, all right? And they have to look at, they have to compare that with the cost, and the cost is the input's price, okay? The input's price is really the input cost, the factor price. So the factor's benefit should be at least as much as its cost. That's kind of like the criteria. So you have to compare the marginal benefit with the marginal cost, and which one ever dominates, that's how you decide whether you go ahead or not. So you would hire the worker if the benefit of that worker is more than its cost. And it should make sense. Just think about it. If you're an employer, why would you employ someone? You would only employ them if they benefit you, right? If what you pay them is not more than what they pay you, right? That's pretty much the logic. And here's where we get this idea of marginal product, which is the increase in a firm's output due to using an additional unit of input, right? So if you remember, the word marginal always means an additional unit, right, involved. So that's where we get the analysis. So if the dollar value of the marginal product of an input is more than the input's price, in other words, if the dollar value produced by one more worker is more than the wage you pay that worker, then is it a good idea to hire that worker? Yeah, I mean, the amount that they're contributing is more than what you are paying them, right? So it's profitable to employ them, right? So you go for it. If the dollar value of the marginal product of an input is less than the input price, if what you pay them, the wage, is more than what they contribute to your output, then it's not profitable to employ. In other words, it's profitable to lay them off, right? Because they're costing you more than what they're benefiting you. If their cost is more than their benefit, then you better lay them off. That's simple logic, really. This is really the same idea of marginal revenue, marginal cost. Okay, so this is what we get. This is the VMPL. Sometimes you might see that. It means the value, the dollar value of the marginal product of labor. Okay, the dollar value of one additional worker contributed to the firm's revenue. Okay, this is the equivalent of marginal revenue, which you've seen before. Now, the conclusion is that labor, land, and capital each earn the value of their marginal contribution to production, right? So the wage rate would be equal to the amount of productivity of that, the dollar value of the productivity of that worker. All right, pause here and take notes. A useful topic in economics is factor mobility, which is the ease with which a factor of production can move. Now, when we say move, one of the meanings of that is the obvious physical moving from one region to another. So for instance, if you think of workers, factor mobility would be the ability of people to move from one region to another, from one city to another, right? The other one, which is a little bit more important, is from one industry to another. So you could be in the same city, maybe in the same downtown area, but having a different usage. All right. So this one is a little bit more important. So when you take your notes, maybe you want to highlight that. That's really what makes more difference. So one general rule here is that it depends on time, right? So if you remember, we had this concept of elasticity, which means responsiveness, right? And the more time that you have, the more able you are to change your uses, right? So people can get reskilled and be absorbed into another industry. Or if you're talking about other forms of inputs or other factors, they can also be used in other industries. So let's look at some examples for this. Let's look at capital, for instance. Capital is one form of input or factor. So some forms of capital are immobile, such as plants, machinery, which are built for a specific purpose. So if you have a very specific type of machinery, then that would be immobile. It's just, it has to be used for that purpose only, right? Other forms of capital are mobile, like trucks, computers, and tools. They can be used in another industry. So first of all, you could easily move trucks and computers from one region to another physically. But more important than that is about the use of that. So you could have a truck which is used to deliver item A, and you could use the same truck to deliver item B. So it can be used for different industries. If you think of a cruise ship, for instance, that's a form of capital. It is mobile between firms, but it's not mobile between industries. So it's always used in the tourism industry, but you could have it used by one firm or another. Okay, pause here. With land, it actually happens to be very mobile. Now you might be like, hang on, land is immobile, you can't move land physically. Yeah, that's true, but the same land can be used in multiple ways. So for instance, if you have a piece of land, you could plant corn on it, or you could plant wheat on it, or you could just build a factory on it. So land can be used in many, many ways, right? So in that sense, it is very mobile. Now, remember that land in economics includes all natural resources. It's not just the actual land. So it also includes wood and oil and water and all that stuff, right? So for instance, if you have wood, you might use your wood to make a chair, right? You could also use that wood to make, I don't know, a toilet seat. And if you don't like that, you can, I don't know, you can build a donkey with it or something, right? So that's very, you have a lot of options with that. So that's very mobile. Labor, most jobs require the physical presence of the workers, which makes it immobile, right? You have to be physically there. Now, there are some exceptions. For instance, some accountants and designers or the owner themselves, they can sometimes work from far away, right? So some contract jobs. So it could differ based on job. So economic mobility in this case would be the same as physical mobility because of that requirement. Another extremely important thing is skills requirements. which do reduce mobility, right? So one example of this, which I think you do want to write it down, is language requirements in Quebec. Language requirements in one region, which means that if you want to get a job in that region, you need to know the language. That is going to reduce mobility because people from other regions can't easily be absorbed in that labor force. Now people decide to move from one place to another or from one job to another based on the monetary consideration, which is wage. That's obvious. But there are also non-monetary considerations, like the type of job, how hard or easy it is, the location, the colleagues there, the social status, right? You could also think of other things like the timings and the freedom available, or the vacation time and so forth, right? So you have to take both of those into account. All right. One thing also about the skills requirement is that if you're a farmer, you can't become a doctor. It takes years and years of expertise, right? So again, if you have more time, yeah, and if you're young, then maybe you can be reskilled to become a doctor. But sometimes there's just such a big gap that older people in one industry cannot move to another industry. Pause here. Wow, that was cool. All right, a very important concept in economics is this concept of economic rent, which is a surplus over the opportunity cost of a resource, or the excess earnings over the minimum needed to keep a factor in its current use. In other words, this is about factors of production. So let's say a worker or land, if it's being used for a certain purpose in a certain industry, what is the next available option, right? What's the cost of that? So that's really opportunity cost. Anything in excess of that, anything more than that would be economic rent. So here's an example. Let's say we have an actress who earns $20 million a year, and she realizes that you need to do a little bit of studies to find this, but let's say she realizes that her next best alternative to acting would be doing commercials, right, on the TV, for instance, or billboards or whatever. And in that case, she would make $5 million, right? So how much is her economic rent? You should be able to find that out. So the difference between what she's earning right now in this job and what she would have earned otherwise, right? So it's kind of like a surplus. Remember, consumer surplus, producer surplus, it's really that. And there's this thing called rent seeking. So rent seeking is increasing one's share of surplus, whether consumer surplus or producer surplus, without creating new wealth, but through socio-political manipulation. So in that sense, it's not really productive. You're not really producing anything. You're not contributing anything. You're just snatching away some profit for yourself from somewhere else. Okay? So it's kind of like this guy. You get to convince the government to give you money without having really produced anything of value. Right? So that's problematic because it reduces factor mobility, right? The inputs remain in one industry, it reduces competition, and it reduces the incentives for productivity because of that. Okay, so it's kind of like trying to find a smart way out instead of being productive, trying to find someone else's share. This is not really good for the whole economy. It's beneficial for that one person or party who gets the benefit, but not for the whole economy. All right.